In the 1990s, when I turned 18, my uncle offered to rent out his summer home by the lake to me and my friends for a week-long spring break vacation. He frequently rented out this space to friends and family, much like a family. At the time, only Airbnb was available, and they promised that once I was old enough, I would be able to rent it out as well. A little background on my uncle. He was extremely wealthy. He and a friend owned a few popular lounges in Las Vegas and Los Angeles in the past. He was cool, but I only saw him a few times a year because he was always in Vegas. But whenever I did, I had a great time. My family and I lived in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, near my uncle's lake. The house was in Antioch, Iowa, which was only about a 20-minute drive since we were both near the border. My parents were hesitant to let me leave, and I assumed it was because I was young and they didn't trust me. But based on what I discovered, I don't believe that was their primary concern. They eventually let me go, but only allowed me to bring 4 friends with me. I only had 3, so everything worked out. My best friend, Tim, joined me the night before. My other 2 friends were supposed to show up to help me get everything ready. My uncle's lake house was not particularly large, but it was nice and included a pool with a hot tub. He had an entire game room downstairs, complete with pinball machines and a pool table. This house was everything I had envisioned when I thought of money. We arrived around 5, and my uncle had been in town a few days before to leave me. The key is in the mailbox. I gave Tim a tour, and he was amazed by how much cool stuff my uncle had. I was excited to show him the basement because it was my favorite part, but I noticed the basement door had a couple of new locks, which I had overlooked. He had some expensive items down there. Finding the keys to all the locks was inconvenient. When we finally arrived down there, I began showing him everything until he mentioned a strange door in the corner, the desk in front of it. We were both curious, so I opened it to find out what was inside. A few boxes were stacked in the corner, while 4 massive gun safes stood against the wall. The first thing that came to mind was, why would someone need 4 gun safes? And I was thinking the same thing. Things my uncle does not hunt. He never has. At least based on what I know. So it was definitely not for animals. Tim tried to persuade me to look through the boxes, but despite my curiosity, I couldn't disrespect my uncle by invading his privacy. I felt like we had seen a lot more than we had. Supposedly, I let him out of the room and locked it. A few days later, Tim mentions the room to our other friends, and they can't stop talking about it. I opened the door to show them the room in order to get them to stop talking, but it only makes them crazier, throwing out various theories about what's in the boxes and gun safes, how many guns he has, and if there are bodies inside. By the end of the night, they were certain he was a serial killer, but I knew my uncle and he was not like that. But my friends pressed me to check the boxes to make sure they weren't filled with missing people's licenses or anything, and if one of my friends hadn't been genuinely terrified of being in a killer's house, I probably wouldn't have looked, even though my curiosity was killing me. I told him I'd peek just to put his mind at ease. I opened the box and found nothing out of the ordinary. A few pipes and a box of cigars, but mostly letters. As I shuffled through them, I noticed my name on one of them. I dug deeper and discovered not only my name, but also the names of my parents, my younger sister, my aunt and her husband, and their children. They attend my school and my sister's school, and next to all of our names and information was how we would die, some in more gruesome ways than others. By this point, I was fully invested, and I was looking through everything else in the box when I discovered several threatening letters addressed to my uncle, essentially stating that if the person sending the letters does not receive the money, various bad things will happen. There were deadlines for sending money and consequences if it was not sent on time. And if that wasn't scary enough, I saw pictures of my oldest cousin walking around outside her campus with a description of what would happen after she was taken. If they did not receive their share by the specified date, I returned everything to the box, which surprised my friends. They consoled me for the remainder of the journey, assuring me that if nothing bad had happened yet, nothing would. The majority of the dates on the letters were from many years ago, so I agreed with them, but I kept thinking about my entire family's life being in my uncle's hands. And if he makes a mistake, even unintentionally, we will all bear the consequences. I told my father when I got home looking for solace, but the only response I got was don't go through other people's stuff, and that was it. This is the end of it. I lived in fear until 2013, when my uncle died, allegedly by suicide. A large part of me wonders whether that's true, And while I was sad, a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders, and I'm sure the rest of my family felt the same way. It was the end of April, and I was moving from Chicago to Nevada. To make things easier, I hired a company to take all of my boxes and ship them to the new house. On me. I wanted to take a road trip down there, stay in some hotels or Airbnbs along the way, and relax. Several days. Dell. The total drive would take about 30 hours, so I divided it in thirds and decided to drive 10 hours per day and stay somewhere else. After calculating the times, I determined that my first stay would have to be on the far outskirts of Nebraska. I scrolled through Airbnb looking for anything cheap, as Nebraska didn't have much to offer, so all I wanted was a place to stay for 8 hours before heading back out on the road. I discovered a small, one-story home with 2 bedrooms. Although I didn't need the 2 bedrooms, the price was very reasonable, so I didn't mind the extra space. However, I found it strange that they only showed photos of 1 bedroom. Again, it didn't make much of a difference to me, so I scheduled it for the next night and went to bed. In the morning, I finished packing my car with the rest of my belongings and began driving. I left a little later than I had planned, but I figured it wouldn't be much of a problem other than driving in the dark for a few hours. If you've ever driven through Nebraska, you'll notice how plain it is. There are long stretches of hundreds of miles with very few lighter buildings. A few hours after dark, I arrived at the Airbnb. It was off a long, empty road. I'd walked up and down a short gravel path. Initially, I was disappointed because the outside appeared to be much more worn down than the pictures showed. I reminded myself that I was only staying for a few hours to sleep, so it wasn't a big deal. I grabbed a few of my bags and walked to the front door. The owners usually leave the key in the key box and give you the password, but the store didn't have one. In fact, there was no lock. It was one of those plain doorknobs you'd find on a closet door. I began to feel uneasy, but I had no other choice but to stay here. I opened the door and stepped inside, and to my surprise, it was actually quite pleasant. The interior was small, but the living room and kitchen were well furnished and appeared to be up to date. I went to the first bedroom, but it was also lacking in amenities. Fortunately, the second bedroom did so. That's where I chose to unpack it. However, there was one aspect of this bedroom that made me extremely uncomfortable. The small old doorway, maybe 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, was on the wall directly in front of the bed. This is the actual photo I took of the doorway in the room. The more I looked at this door, the more concerned I became. But there was no way I was staying in a room that I couldn't secure. I attempted to open it just to see what was behind it, but it was locked from the other side. I assumed the owner had just kept some cleaning supplies or extra towels back there, but the store still gave me the creeps. I was getting tired, so I only unpacked what I needed for the night and began to prepare for bed. I awoke in the middle of the night to a soft tapping noise coming from the edge of the bed. It was very subtle, but the entire house remained silent. Aside from the tapping, I reached blindly for my phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight as quickly as possible. The tapping stopped when I shined the light towards the edge of the bed. I don't get scared easily. Sure, I'll feel creeped out or nervous, but never scared. But something about that small doorway on the edge of my bed scared me. I jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, grabbed everything, and dashed out of the house as fast as I could. It was still very dark outside, and I couldn't see much, but as I was backing my car out the gravel pathways, I swear that I saw a man lying on the ground behind the house. I drove down the road for about 30 minutes before pulling over and texting the owner to inform him that there might be someone in his house and that he should call the police. I drove down the road for a few hours until I reached the small town, where I parked in a grocery store parking lot to get some sleep. I'm still not sure what happened at that Airbnb, but the creepiest part was that when I checked my phone in the morning, I discovered my message had been read only a few minutes after I sent it. However, the owner never responded to it. My college friends and I were getting together for a summer weekend to party and hang out. I was planning our stay at an Airbnb. It was a cabin far out in the forest near our old campus, which meant we could party loudly and do whatever we wanted. I rented it out for both the weekend and the 2 days prior. I'd like to spend some time there alone and make it a full vacation week for myself. When I arrived, I was astounded by the view. The cabin was situated in the middle of a field of grass with a massive forest in the background. I went inside and walked around. It was incredible. It was huge, and being so far out was liberating. After arranging my belongings in one of the bedrooms, I put on some hiking clothes and went for a walk through the forest. There were a few trails that went around the tree line. They were all faint, and they weren't on regular public trails or forest preserves in those areas. I selected a random one and began walking down. The forest became denser as I walked down, with less grass between the trees, until I discovered the small opening. There were a few small tents or huts set up on this open field of grass. They appeared dirty and weathered. I approached them and looked around the site, discovering a plethora of items. I wasn't sure what this place was. It had to be a campsite of some sort, but it had been abandoned, with everything left behind. I couldn't understand why that would be the case. After a few minutes of exploring, I started walking back to avoid becoming too creeped out. It was on my mind throughout the walk back, but my thoughts were interrupted when I reached the tree line near the cabin. In the field, someone was standing and staring at the cabin. I didn't want to approach them or make myself known, so I stood by a tree and watched as they looked at the Airbnb and walked around it, as if they were concerned about being noticed. After a minute, they left and began walking towards the forest, where I was. I hid behind the trees, and as they approached the tree line, I could hear their footsteps coming within a few feet of me before they passed by and continued down the trail. I was just on. Fortunately, they had not noticed me. I dashed back to the cabin, locking up everything I could. Every window, door, literally anything, and spent the entire day staring out the windows, trying to figure out who that was and why he was creeping around the cabin. When the sun went down, it had been about 4 or 5 hours since I'd seen them, and I was more confident that they were just a hiker or something that happened by. Their behavior was strange, but I couldn't see anything else to indicate that they were attempting to do something harmful. I went to bed between 11 and 12, but I kept drifting in and out of sleep. There was a strange sensation bothering me, causing me to wake up every 30 minutes with unease. In the middle of the night, after waking up 3 or 4 times, I was startled awake by the sudden sound of something shattering across the cabin. I stood up, grabbed the nearest weaponizable object, and ran to the end of the house. I saw a beam of moonlight shine through a shattered window and onto the floor below. It was a heavy rock. I looked around the entire room before going up to the window and looking out. Far in the field, near the tree line, I saw a figure running away, only to fade into the darkness around the trees seconds later. I took my car and drove into town, involving the police. They conducted an investigation and had me speak with the Airbnb owner as well, but nothing came up. I was able to arrange for us to stay somewhere else for the weekend, and we still had a good time. That man's identity is still unknown, as is why he was stalking the cabin and throwing a rock through the window.